Somewhere in Tunisia, February 1943, a German maintenance sergeant crouches beside an olive-drab motorcycle, his hands still trembling as he removes the air cleaner cover. The Harley-Davidson WLA sits silent in the captured American motor pool, surrounded by dozens more just like it. He's been a mechanic for 15 years, trained on the finest German engineering, worked on BMWs that represented the peak of European motorcycle design. But what he's looking at now makes his throat tighten with a realization that has nothing to do with mechanics and everything to do with mathematics. This isn't just a motorcycle. It's a message written in steel and gasoline. And the message is simple. America can bury us. The motorcycle before him is crude by German standards. The 45 cubic inch flathead engine, a side valve design that BMW abandoned years ago in favor of more efficient overhead valve technology, represents engineering that seems almost primitive. The Springer front suspension is outdated. There's no rear suspension at all, earning these machines the nickname hardtail among American riders. The 3-speed handshift transmission is simple, almost agricultural in its design. Everything about this machine screams mass production over refinement, quantity over quality, but that's precisely what makes it terrifying. In Berlin, motorcycles like the BMW R75 or the Zundap KS750 are celebrated as technological marvels, precision-built, meticulously tuned, engineered to perfection. But they are difficult to produce, difficult to repair, and nearly impossible to replace at the speed the front lines consume them. This American WLA, by comparison, looks like it was designed to be stamped, boxed, loaded on a ship, dropped into a desert, and forgotten, until a farmhand with a wrench needs to fix it in 5 minutes and ride it into battle again. The sergeant's breath hangs in the cool morning air. He expected to feel superiority. Instead, he feels dread. Because this ugly little motorcycle is proof of something no one in his uniform wants to say out loud. America doesn't need to outfight them. It only needs to outbuild them. And as he stares at the crude machine that shouldn't have mattered, he realizes it already has. The mechanic's name is Karl Ritter, Oberfeldwebel of the 10th Panzer Division's maintenance detachment. Before the war, he was a quiet Bavarian machinist who spent his evenings drafting blueprints for engines he hoped one day to build under his own name. He once believed Germany would become the global capital of engineering brilliance, where precision was art and complexity was proof of mastery. But here, in North Africa, surrounded by broken supply lines and equipment cannibalized more than it is serviced, that belief is wearing thin. Every German machine that reaches his depot arrives wounded. A bent axle, a missing gear tooth, a cracked casing from desert heat cycling through extremes. Spare parts? Sometimes they arrive. Most of the time they don't. Karl and his men have become blacksmiths more than mechanics, fabricating components by hand that factories back home no longer have the metal or manpower to produce. Instructors once warned them that war turns engineers into improvisers. None of them expected improviser to mean scrapyard surgeon. He wipes sand from his forehead and glances around the depot. It's a graveyard of German excellence, half-dissembled BMWs lined up like battlefield casualties, pride pieces of the fatherland, now motionless under burlap covers. Most of them run beautifully when new. Almost none of them run for long out here. The desert doesn't care about tolerances or craftsmanship. It only rewards what survives neglect. And then there's this American motorcycle. Not covered, not disassembled, just parked casually like a tool meant to be grabbed and used again in 5 minutes. The Wehrmacht officers who brought it here didn't even treat it like a trophy. They tossed it to the mechanics like scrap iron. "Fix it," the lieutenant said with a smirk, intending mockery. "Let's see if American trash can be resurrected." Now Karl stands before it, realizing it may not need resurrection at all, just fuel. He opens the side compartment and pauses. Inside is something he hasn't seen in years, a full-service toolkit, neatly arranged. No scavenging, no hunting for a specialty wrench forged by a single Bavarian factory back home. Just common tools, universal, interchangeable, cheap to make, but there, ready for the soldier. His throat tightens again. This isn't a soldier's motorcycle. It's a company's motorcycle, built by a nation mobilized like a factory floor. He tries to push the thought away, but the seed is planted. If this one bike was produced with such simplicity, then how many more? 10,000? 50,000? 100,000? Built, shipped, fueled, fielded faster than Germany can even debate improvements to a single model? Behind him, 2 other mechanics are stripping parts from a disabled R75. One curses. The gear housing cracked again, impossible to replace without a factory-made casting. Karl remembers the lieutenant's words from weeks ago. "We may not have as many machines as the Americans, but ours are superior." Once he nodded. Now he hesitates. This WLA does not pretend to be superior. Its message is shameless. We can break and still return tomorrow. Like a hammer. Like a shovel. Like an army with endless reserves. Carl feels a shiver run through him. In Germany, machines are built like sculptures, works of pride. In America, machines are built like ammunition, expendable but infinite. He kneels again, staring at the flathead casing. No complicated valve geometry. No specialized heat-treated alloy, just steel and simplicity. And in simplicity, there is speed. Not speed on the road, but speed in the war effort. For the first time in months, Carl is not thinking like a soldier of the Reich. He is thinking like a mechanic. Someone who understands that wars are not won by perfection. They are won by momentum, and this crude motorcycle is momentum made visible. Before long, his men notice him lingering over the foreign machine. One of them grins. Let me guess, American garbage? Carl almost answers yes. But the word catches in his throat, because for the first time, he's not sure. Carl doesn't answer the mechanic's joke. Not yet. Instead, he gently lowers the toolkit lid and slides it back into its compartment. The movement is slow, deliberate, as if he is closing the lid on a question he is not ready to speak aloud. He checks the fuel line, the carburetor throat, the filter placement. Everything is laid out like a textbook example of clarity. Not elegant, no German engineer would ever call it that, but obvious. He could teach a farm recruit how to disassemble and reassemble this carburetor in an afternoon. With a BMW carburetor, he would need diagrams, tolerances sheet, specialty tools, and patience. Lots of patience. That thought unsettles him. Another mechanic walks over, Voss, a loud, sarcastic Berliner with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. Still studying that American tractor? Voss scoffs. Their pilots probably parachute with a manual and a wrench. Carl doesn't laugh. Maybe that's the point, he mutters. The others don't hear him. He removes the spark plug next. It is clean, unremarkable, and, most importantly, identical to the spares tucked inside the toolkit. Standardization. Interchangeability. A concept German doctrine has always theoretically praised, yet seldom practices. German engineers build systems like clockmakers. American engineers build them like logisticians. Strange, Carl murmurs. What? Voss asks. He holds up the spare plug. The Americans expect this to fail, so they make the failure irrelevant. Voss snorts. Primitive. Carl nods slowly. No, prepared. That one word sticks heavier than intended. As he continues inspecting the machine, more uncomfortable realizations spread through his mind like cracks through glass. The frame is heavier than a German bike's, but simpler to weld. The wiring harness is exposed, which means breakage is easy to diagnose. The air filter is designed for quick field replacement, which means dust, sand, and punishment were not afterthoughts. They were assumptions. Then he sees something that truly stops him. Stamped into multiple parts of the frame are small coded letters. Not for decoration, not for engineering pride, but to indicate which part goes where during high-speed factory assembly. Not even for soldiers, for factory workers. Workers who likely never even saw a battlefield. Carl exhales slowly. This motorcycle is not built to live forever. It is built to be reborn endlessly. He rises to his feet and wipes his hands on a rag. He looks around the depot. Broken masterpieces. German brilliance strangled by German shortages. Perfection choked by attrition. The Reich can build a better machine, but only once. America can build a good enough machine 1,000 times before lunch. A courier drives past the depot in a dusty Kübelwagen, shouting updates from command. The Afrika Korps had seized fuel from a British convoy. A temporary victory. Carl used to feel pride when he heard news like that. But today, listening to the courier boast, he hears a different truth beneath the headlines. Germany is celebrating scraps. America is shipping reserves. One is reacting. The other is supplying. As this thought coils deeper inside him, he glances again at the Harley. It doesn't feel like a vehicle anymore. It feels like a statistic with handlebars. He kneels a final time, checking the clutch linkage. Barely worn. The metal tolerances are loose enough that desert grit can't cripple it. His BMW at home would cough itself to death in this environment. Voss wipes his hands and sighs. Well, do we salvage it or strip it for scrap? Carl stares at the bike, not like a mechanic evaluating a machine, but like a man reading a prophecy disguised as hardware. We salvage it, he replies finally. Voss looks surprised. Why this one? Carl closes the toolkit completely now. Because, he says quietly, It's going to outlive all of ours, and as the words leave his mouth, he feels it, the flicker of a truth he doesn't want to admit. This motorcycle is not an enemy trophy. It is a warning. Carl doesn't return to the German motorcycles immediately. Instead, he stays with the Harley, almost compelled by a quiet dread spreading behind his ribs. Every nut he turns, every bracket he examines, reinforces the same conclusion. This machine was never meant to be admired. It was meant to be replicated, and replicated quickly. Two mechanics drag a damaged BMW frame past him. The suspension collapsed, the gearbox cracked. Carl can hear them muttering about machining tolerances and sourcing bearings. If Berlin can send them, one says. The other laughs bitterly. If. That word has become a shadow that hangs over every repair order. Carl keeps working. The seat on the Harley lifts easily. No special tool, just a wing nut. Beneath it sits an oiled canvas pouch, and inside the pouch, he finds something that stops him entirely. Not a blueprint, not a technical diagram. A folded instruction leaflet, written not for engineers, not for mechanics, but for soldiers. Simple language, step-by-step repair instructions, even illustrations, and no secrecy. No locked manuals, no officer approval. The Americans want their soldiers to fix their machines on their own. That means they expect their machines to break, and design them to break without dying. A German officer walking by notices Carl holding the leaflet. Reading bedtime stories now, Ritter? He smirks. Carl stands silently, folding the leaflet back into its pouch. Once the officer leaves, Voss returns with a smug grin. Let me guess, their manuals are for children. Carl looks at him, not with superiority, but with something closer to fear. No, he says softly. They are for armies that plan to keep moving. Voss frowns, not understanding. Carl gestures around them. We build machines to impress engineers. They build machines to empower infantry. They don't need perfection. They need continuity. His own words ring in his ears like cannon fire. Continuity, momentum, scale. Suddenly, a thought strikes him. Something deeper than mechanics. If the Americans can produce motorcycles at this level of simplicity, then their tanks must follow similar philosophy. Their trucks, their guns, their aircraft, even if each one is slightly inferior in isolation, the system that supports them is unstoppable. Mass production is not a detail of American strategy. It is the strategy. For the first time since the war began, Carl feels the horizon tilt. He rises and walks across the depot floor to a disabled BMW sidecar unit. He puts his hands on its cooling fins and thinks of the factories back home. Starved of materials, rationed for fuel, bombed, then rebuilt, then bombed again. Germany is fighting to keep production alive. America is fighting to increase it. On the far side of the depot, he sees crates stamped with German eagle seals. Spare parts rationed and accounted for like gold. Next to the Harley, he sees tools laid out casually, as if even losing them would mean nothing, because 1,000 more crates wait behind 1,000 more ships. He returns to the Harley slowly, as if gravity itself has changed. This crude, inelegant, unrefined motorcycle is proof of a greater truth. The Reich is not competing with American engineering. It is competing with American multiplication. He runs a hand along the tank and realizes with a sudden, hollow finality, this machine does not represent a counterpart to German machinery. It represents an entire industrial philosophy Germany cannot match anymore. The war is still raging. Tunisia is still contested. Berlin still broadcasts speeches about destiny and willpower. But Carl isn't listening to speeches now. He is listening to a motorcycle that speaks with steel instead of rhetoric. When he finally exhales, the thought that forms is one he knows he can never speak aloud. Not to Voss, not to the lieutenant, not to anyone. We cannot outbuild this. For the first time he sees not the battle, but the inevitable. And standing beside a silent Harley-Davidson in the North African desert, Carl Ritter understands something chilling. Before Berlin knows it, the war is already lost. Carl doesn't move for several seconds. The depot around him hums with the clatter of tools and muttered complaints from tired mechanics. But it all feels distant now, like he's standing behind a thick pane of glass, watching the world rather than participating in it. The Harley didn't just reveal a flaw in German engineering. It revealed a flaw in German thinking. For years, the Reich told its soldiers that German superiority came from being better. But what if the Americans were winning not by being better, but by being faster? That realization presses into his chest like a cold blade. He looks again at the American logo stamped into the metal. Not elegant, not ceremonial, not adorned with imperial curves, just functional. The kind of branding that assumes there are more machines than individuals, more replacements than repairs, more shipments coming tomorrow than questions asked today. Perfection is a burden. Mass production is momentum. He swallows hard. For the first time, he realizes the terrifying difference between a nation fighting a war and a nation manufacturing one. He tries to push the thought away, but it keeps echoing forward. If this is the simplicity of their motorcycles, then what of their trucks? What of their aviation? Their supply routes? Their radios? Their boots? Their bullets? The longer he stands there, the more he understands. This war isn't being fought on the battlefield. It's being fought at the factory, and the factories have already chosen the winner. A diesel engine backfires across the depot, jolting him from thought. He wipes his palms on his trousers, suddenly aware of sweat on his hand even in the desert chill. He glances at his men, Voss and the others, still joking, still convinced that technical superiority is destiny. They don't know what he now understands. Maybe they're not ready to. Maybe no one here is ready to accept that the battle isn't between soldiers and soldiers, but between industry and exhaustion. His gaze returns to the Harley. This machine is more than a captured trophy. It is a mirror, a glimpse at a nation that treats war like logistics rather than glory. Germany still worships craftsmanship. America worships output. In a long war, output always devours craftsmanship. He grips the handlebar and lifts the bike upright, feeling the weight settle into its frame. As it balances, something else in his mind does too, a quiet, reluctant understanding of the future. He imagines, for a moment, the war ending not with a triumphant speech or final battle, but with a slow starvation of parts, of fuel, of replacements. Not heroes falling, but assembly lines failing. That is how great nations die in modern war. He draws in a long breath. If you are watching this video right now, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? The world that was being reshaped in this desert would ripple outward for decades. The machines that fought this war didn't just move soldiers. They reshaped entire societies. And before we continue deeper, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this. Because too many people think wars are lost in gunfights. The truth is, many wars are lost in the workshop, long before the first bullet is fired. Carl doesn't know American geography beyond vague maps his officers drew in chalk, but he suddenly imagines vast cities filled with foundries, rail hubs, and miles of factory lines. Not 1,000 workers, hundreds of thousands. Not one precision casting, 10,000 stamped plates. Not one perfect engine, 1,000,000 good enough ones, and good enough is eternal when it never runs dry. He returns to the Harley and rests one hand on the tank. In its crude steel, he sees New York shipyards, Detroit assembly lines, Pittsburgh steel mills. He sees not a motorcycle, but a machine built upon an ocean of machines. Germany is fighting with pride. America is fighting with abundance, and in war, abundance wins. That is the truth the Reich will never admit. But every wrench in Carl's hand is beginning to confirm. That evening, Carl files an informal maintenance report. Half routine, half reflex. But the words feel heavier than metal. He writes that the WLA is serviceable, requires minimal refurbishment, and can be returned to operation within a day. If this were a German motorcycle, within a day would be a fantasy. Here it is simply expected. He places the clipboard down slowly. His lieutenant, Oberleutnant Hafner, strides into the depot not long after Sue. Crisp uniform, polished boots, smelling of cologne from a supply crate meant for officers only. Men like him have never had to disassemble a gearbox in desert wind, or fabricate a bearing from scrap just to keep a vehicle alive. He stops beside Carl. Well, Hafner asks, did you confirm what we suspected? Cheap American imitation? Carl hesitates. Not out of fear, but because he realizes the lieutenant is not asking for an assessment. He is asking for validation, a script. The same one Berlin has been handing down for years. It functions, Carl replies carefully. It is. Different from our design philosophy? Hafner folds his arms. Inferior. Carl doesn't nod. He doesn't shake his head either, only lowers his eyes. Inferior, the lieutenant repeats with finality, as if by saying it enough times he can make it true. Then he dismisses the subject and strides off to harass another mechanic about a stalled truck. Carl watches him go with a tightening jaw. That is the Reich's problem in miniature. When the truth threatens pride, pride always wins, even when pride kills. Later that night, under the thin lantern glow of the depot's workshop tent, Carl continues inspecting the Harley alone. No officers, no audience. Just a man, and the uncomfortable truth echoing inside his skull. He pulls the side panels away and checks the primary chain. A few adjustments. Barely worn. Replacement intervals simplified. No complex lubrication channels. No special tolerances. Everything about this machine is designed to survive ignorance and abuse. And the worst part? It's working. He sits back on his heels, staring at the engine casing. The Americans have achieved what Germany never considered. They built a motorcycle that is not a showpiece of capability, but a tool of inevitability. There's a soft shuffle behind him. Still studying it? Voss mutters, stepping closer. Carl doesn't look up. It doesn't need studying, he replies. That's the point. Voss raises a brow. Meaning? Carl closes the inspection panel. Meaning any soldier can fix this. With ours, you need a mechanic. With theirs, you need only a soldier. Voss laughs lightly. So our machines are more sophisticated. Carl looks up, and this time his eyes are tired. Not from labor, but from understanding. No, he says, ours are more fragile. That silences Voss. Outside, an armored column rumbles past, engines grinding, fuel wasting, delicate machinery wearing down piece by piece. Carl listens and thinks of the Americans again. Trains, factories, stamped parts rolling off assembly lines like bread loaves, identical and endless. He imagines the war stretching another year, 2 years, 5. A chilling question surfaces. Can Germany even survive a long war of machines? He knows the answer already. By the time the lantern burns low, the realization is no longer theory, it's conviction. This motorcycle is a preview of defeat. Not because it is faster, not because it is tougher, not because it is engineered smarter, but because it can be rebuilt, replaced, and redeployed faster than the Reich can mourn the last one that broke. Carl runs a hand through his hair and breathes in the smell of oil and sand. The war is still raging, but he now sees the finish line. And it isn't painted in victory banners. It's painted in production quotas. He pauses, staring into the tent's flickering light. And the thought takes full shape for the first time. Germany will not run out of courage. It will run out of engines. By the spring of 1944, the war had moved far beyond that Tunisian motor pool. But the German sergeant's first uneasy realization had spread like a shadow across the German officer corps. It wasn't spoken about in official reports because no commander dared put such a thing into writing. But men who understood machines, who understood production, logistics, and the cruel arithmetic of industrial warfare, could see what was coming long before the first American bombs fell on German soil. They saw it in rivets, in casting lines, in stamped brackets, and pressed steel frames. They saw it in the Harley WLA. That crude, rattling motorcycle had been only a preview of something much larger. By the time American factories were fully mobilized, Detroit alone was producing more vehicles in 6 months than Germany could build in 2 years. The US wasn't designing the best machine, it was designing the most buildable machine. A motorcycle that a farm boy could service in a ditch with a screwdriver and a length of wire. A truck that could be disassembled by 9 soldiers in a muddy field, and repaired faster than the Germans could even order replacement parts. And while Germany continued building masterpieces, America built momentum. The Wehrmacht had learned how to conquer nations. America had mastered how to replace losses. That was the great turning point. The moment the war stopped being about who had the best troops, and started being about whose factories would still be running in 12 months. The men closest to the machines realized the truth first. The Third Reich wasn't losing on the battlefield. It was bleeding out on the assembly line. Even the German mechanics working in occupied France and Italy began quietly modifying their expectations. They used to mock the WLA, its clunky controls, its low compression, its side valve inefficiency, but by 1944, those same mechanics were salvaging captured WLAs and using them for their own repair runs. Why? Because they ran forever. Because spare parts were everywhere. Because an American crate dropped from a plane contained enough components to bring 30 motorcycles back to life. German motorcycles had to be requested. American motorcycles had to be contained. There is a haunting report from a logistics officer in Normandy, found later in a box of papers after the war, describing a column of destroyed German motorcycles lined up beside a single captured WLA still running, despite 2 bullet holes in the crankcase and a cracked headlamp. The officer didn't praise its performance. He didn't marvel at its engineering. He simply wrote one line. They can lose 100 and still have 100 more. That is when the psychological collapse began. Not in Berlin, not in Hitler's bunker, not even in the panzer divisions crushed under Allied bombing. But in the quiet minds of the men turning wrenches and counting what remained, the men who knew that war is math wearing camouflage, the Harley wasn't just a vehicle, it was a warning. A prophecy disguised as a machine. The sergeant from Tunisia, now stationed in northern Italy, watched as new American equipment arrived faster than German units could destroy it. Replacement parts came in wooden crates stamped with English instructions, simplified for anyone to understand. Meanwhile, German mechanics waited weeks for a single precision-machined carburetor. He had once believed engineering superiority meant victory. Now he understood. Engineering superiority without industrial capacity meant nothing. The WLA wasn't built to impress. It was built to exist everywhere. And as 1944 ground on, the German sergeant came to a final quiet truth that he would never dare speak aloud. The Allies didn't need to outthink Germany. They only needed to outlast it. And they already had. By late 1944, the German sergeant's hands no longer trembled when he saw a Harley WLA. Now they only tightened. He wasn't shocked anymore. He was tired. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with inevitability. Each captured shipment, each burned convoy, each overrun depot carried the same silent confirmation. Germany was no longer fighting a war of victory. It was fighting a war of delay. He watched Panther tanks sit motionless for lack of spare parts, while American Shermans, not better, not tougher, just replaceable, kept rolling past wreckage like water wearing down stone. He heard pilots complain that their fighters were perfect machines built for perfect pilots, but there were no perfect pilots left to fly them. He saw logistics officers writing ration reports that looked less like military planning and more like a countdown. The Third Reich wasn't losing because it was outgunned. It was losing because it was outbuilt. And every Harley that roared past German lines was a reminder that the enemy could keep replacing what it lost indefinitely, while Germany was losing men and machines it could never replace. By autumn, the sergeant found himself sabotaging German precision, though he would never have admitted it, even to himself. When a fuel pump was late arriving, he improvised. When a bearing seized, he reused one that should have been discarded. When the manual specified a tolerance of 0.004 of a millimeter, he shrugged and made do with 10. It wasn't carelessness. It was resignation. Because when perfection becomes impossible, practicality becomes survival. He had become, without realizing it, more American in mentality than German, not in patriotism. In pragmatism, American soldiers didn't worship the machine. They used it until it broke, then bolted in a new part and kept moving. German doctrine said, preserve quality. American doctrine said, preserve movement. Movement wins wars. And everywhere he looked in the final year of the conflict, only one side was still moving forward. He began to notice other small signs, a growing superstition among panzer crews. If you found a WLA abandoned in a field, it meant more Americans were coming than your maps showed. Artillery spotters used them, MPs used them, scouts used them, medics used them. Sometimes the same motorcycle passed through 5 hands in a single week, still running. It became a symbol of something the Germans no longer possessed. Continuity. Even when bombers destroyed rail lines, supply depots, roads, or bridges, somehow WLAs still made it through. They weren't fast, but they were everywhere, like stubborn grass pushing through cracks in pavement. And deep down, under layers of discipline and conditioning, the sergeant knew why. Because the Americans treated war the way engineers treat stress tests. Not as a duel of pride, but as a test of failure rate. Which army breaks first? Not tactically, logistically. Germany had gambled on brilliance. America had invested in certainty. By December, rumors had spread of Allied factories so vast that even strategic bombing barely slowed them. Entire factories on rail platforms picked up, moved west, rebuilt in weeks. Miles of assembly lines dedicated not to innovation, but stability. Tanks rolling off like bread loaves. Crates of engines stacked like cordwood. The sergeant didn't fear the American soldier. He feared the American replacement. He had once believed machines were the pride of nations, testaments to genius and craftsmanship. Now he understood the truth he had never been taught but could no longer ignore. In a war of exhaustion, the greatest weapon isn't a masterpiece. It's a machine you can build faster than the enemy can destroy. The Harley WLA didn't defeat Germany by outperforming it. It defeated Germany by outlasting it. By the time the war reached its closing chapters, the German sergeant had stopped thinking of the Harley as a curiosity. He now regarded it as a prophecy he had witnessed far too early, and understood far too late. When he first unscrewed that air cleaner cover in Tunisia, He thought he was evaluating a motorcycle. In truth, he was reading the future. What he had seen in 1943 was never about horsepower or metallurgy. It was about a country that could build 10 versions of good enough faster than Germany could build one version of perfect. That wasn't engineering. That was inevitability. And inevitability is the deadliest weapon in any war. By early 1945, rumors from the Eastern Front reached their maintenance depots. Stories of German factories running on ghosts, of conscript laborers building machines they no longer believed in, of tanks rushed to the front before their paint could dry. Meanwhile, American equipment looked older, but not tired. Because whether it was boots, rifles, trucks, or motorcycles, the Americans simply kept replacing everything before it ever reached the point of despair. Perfection dies when it cannot reproduce itself. Simplicity survives because anyone can keep it alive. That is what he realized the day he watched two teenage American MPs changing a headlamp bulb on a Harley with pocket tools and a grin, while his own crews needed precision instruments, schematics, and spare parts they no longer had. Those boys weren't trained technicians. They were barely trained drivers. But the machine didn't require experts. It only required momentum. One night, as Allied artillery thundered in the distance, he found himself writing a note in the corner of his maintenance ledger. We cannot outlast a nation that builds war, like it builds agriculture. Harvest after harvest, surplus after surplus. The German high command still preached victory. The men in the field were already preaching survival. That shift, silent, unspoken, was the moment defeat became irreversible. For years, Germany had believed the battlefield was defined by talent, ingenuity, and mechanical sophistication. But victory didn't belong to the army with the most brilliant machine. Victory belonged to the army that could afford to lose one. He would not survive the war as a soldier, not because he died in battle, but because when Germany finally surrendered, he surrendered something else with it, his belief in what superior meant. Decades later, when he was a civilian again, long after the Reich had collapsed into memory and rubble, he visited a small motorcycle meet outside Stuttgart. There, standing among gleaming chrome restorations and polished BMW classics, was a Harley WLA, preserved, restored, almost exactly as crude as he remembered it. He didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. He looked at it the way veterans look at monuments, not with admiration, but with recognition. It was not a beautiful machine. It was not a precise machine, but it was the most honest machine he had ever encountered. Because this motorcycle had never pretended to be invincible. It had only promised it would keep going. And keeping going is what wins wars. Just before he turned to leave, he rested his hand on the seat, leather cracked and faded with time, and whispered the only eulogy a man like him could ever offer. We built masterpieces. They built the future. By the time the war ended, the Harley WLA had become more than a motorcycle. It was a traveling omen. Wherever it appeared, German lines eventually cracked. Not because it was fast, not because it was deadly, but because it represented something Germany could no longer manufacture: continuity, abundance, and inevitability. Years later, historians would argue endlessly about what truly defeated the Axis: tactics, generals, industry, or ideology. But for men like that German sergeant, the answer lived in something far simpler: a low-tech, mass-produced courier of reality that rode ahead of the Americans like a messenger of momentum. And as the world rebuilt itself, that philosophy won the peace as well as the war. The United States didn't just occupy territory, it occupied the future. Factories once used to build WLAs were refitted to build refrigerators, cars, radios, and eventually televisions. Germany would later become an industrial powerhouse again, but only after adopting the very principle it once dismissed: durability over perfection, production over pride. That mechanic never forgot the first Harley he studied in that dusty Tunisian depot. For him, it marked the moment when he stopped asking, "Can we win?" and quietly began asking, "How long until we can't?" Sometimes the turning point of a war isn't a battle, or a speech, or a map line moving on a screen. Sometimes it's a trembling hand removing an air filter cover, and realizing you're already looking at history's verdict. Before we finalize the upload package, description, tags, thumbnail prompts, quick engagement line to end the video. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy hidden Wii stories like this one, hit subscribe. We've got more coming.